Section 1. A Question of Quality. November 23, 1942. The dust of the North African desert, fine as powdered sugar, coated everything. It worked its way into the gears of machinery, into the lungs of soldiers, and into the very fabric of the conflict itself. From the turret of a Panzer IV, a veteran German commander peered through his binoculars, his eyes tracing the silhouette of a new adversary. It was the American M4 Sherman, recently arrived to bolster the British Eighth Army. He watched it move across the undulating terrain, its tall profile, a stark, and, to his trained eye, vulnerable shape against the pale sky. A low chuckle might have rumbled in his chest, a sound of professional appraisal mixed with a confident, almost dismissive assessment. To the men of the Afrika Korps, hardened by years of mechanized warfare, this new machine seemed crude. It was tall, presenting a generous target. Its armor, a mere 51 millimeters at its thickest point on the hull front, seemed woefully inadequate. The 75 millimeter M3 gun it mounted appeared modest, a general-purpose weapon in an era of increasingly specialized and powerful anti-tank cannons. In the mess tents and workshops of the Wehrmacht, the whispers would have been derisive. They would have compared it to their own evolving arsenal. They knew what was coming from their factories back home. The Panther, a beast with a sloped 80 millimeter frontal plate, and the magnificent, high-velocity KWK-42L70 cannon that could slice through Allied armor at immense distances. They had the Tiger, a behemoth whose very name was a psychological weapon, its 88 millimeter gun an object of legendary fear. The Sherman, by contrast, looked like a relic of a simpler time, a machine built without a true understanding of the brutal calculus of tank-on-tank combat. This perception was not born of arrogance alone, but of a deeply ingrained military and industrial philosophy. The German approach to armored warfare was one of technological supremacy. It was a philosophy of quality over quantity, of creating panzers that were, on a one-to-one basis, the undisputed masters of the battlefield. This thinking was personified by their tank aces, men like Michael Wittmann and Otto Carius, whose exploits became the stuff of legend. In their memoirs and after-action reports, they would describe encounters with the Sherman in terms that reinforced this initial assessment. They saw it as a Tommy cooker, or a Ronson, a reference to its perceived tendency to ignite when hit, a perception that, while statistically debated for years after the war, became a powerful and demoralizing myth. For a Panther or Tiger crew, sighting a column of Shermans was not a cause for alarm, but an opportunity. They were confident in their superior armor, which could often shrug off the Sherman's 75 millimeter shells at combat ranges, and in their superior firepower, which could disable the American tank from a kilometer away or more. The German doctrine was to use these technological spearheads to punch holes in enemy lines, to achieve decisive breakthroughs through superior engineering and the skill of their elite crews. They viewed warfare as an art form perfected by engineering genius, where a single, perfectly crafted sword could defeat a dozen crude clubs. What these veteran Panzer crews, squinting through the desert haze, could not see was the true nature of the weapon they were facing. They saw the tank, but they did not see the system that produced it. They saw the 51 millimeters of steel, but they did not see the industrial philosophy that placed it there. They assessed the 75 millimeter gun, but they could not comprehend the logistical miracle that supplied it with an endless stream of ammunition. The initial laughter and dismissal of the Sherman was, in essence, a profound misreading of the enemy. It was the understandable but ultimately fatal error of judging a book by its cover, of assessing a weapon by its individual specifications rather than by the grand strategy it represented. The German commanders saw a flawed tank. They failed to see the industrial avalanche that was about to be unleashed upon them. They believed the war would be won by the finest tanks, crude by the most skilled aces. They were about to learn a terrifying lesson taught by the United States of America. The war would be won by the nation that could put the most tanks on the field, keep them running, and replace them faster than the enemy could disable them. The Sherman was not merely a tank. It was the physical embodiment of a different way of war, a philosophy of overwhelming, inexorable, mass-produced might. And as the first few Shermans rumbled into action at the Second Battle of El Alamein, they were the quiet harbingers of a storm of steel that would, in time, grind the German war machine to dust. The laughter in the desert would soon die down, replaced by a growing sense of disbelief. And then, a dawning, terrible understanding of the true power they had so casually underestimated. The crude American tank was here, and it was here to stay, not as a single duelist, but as a legion. Section 2. The Arsenal of Democracy. The story of the M4 Sherman does not begin on the battlefield, but in the sprawling, humming factories of the American Midwest. It begins in the minds of men like William S. Knudsen, the president of General Motors, who was tapped by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to lead the nation's colossal production effort. The philosophy that birthed the Sherman was uniquely American, forged in the crucible of mass-market automobile manufacturing. It was a philosophy that prized simplicity, reliability, and, above all, producibility. While German engineers were meticulously handcrafting complex, powerful machines like the Tiger, American engineers were asking a different set of questions. They were not asking, how can we build the most powerful tank in the world? They were asking, how can we build a very good tank, and how can we build 10,000 of them by next year? This fundamental difference in approach would decide the fate of the war on the ground. When the United States entered the war, its industrial capacity was a sleeping giant. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the deafening alarm clock that awoke it. In a matter of months, the nation's vast automotive industry performed a pivot of staggering scale and speed. Assembly lines that once produced family sedans and farm tractors were retooled to produce the engines of war. The numbers associated with this transformation are difficult to comprehend even today. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 49,234 M4 Sherman tanks. To put this figure in perspective, Germany, over the entire course of the war, managed to build approximately 1,350 Tiger I tanks, about 500 of the formidable Tiger II, and just under 6,000 Panthers. The disparity is astronomical. At its peak, the United States was capable of rolling out up to 2,000 Sherman tanks in a single month. German production of all tank types, plagued by complex designs, resource shortages, and relentless Allied bombing, rarely exceeded a few hundred per month. This was not a battle of quality versus quantity. It was a battle of two entirely different industrial ages. The German method was akin to that of a master watchmaker, creating intricate, beautiful, and highly effective timepieces in limited numbers. The American method was that of Henry Ford, applying the principles of the moving assembly line to create a product that was reliable, easy to repair, and available in overwhelming numbers. The heart of this industrial behemoth was the Detroit Tank Arsenal, a facility built and operated by the Chrysler Corporation. It was a monument to American industrial ingenuity, a place where raw steel entered at one end and fully functional Sherman tanks rolled out the other in a continuous, unceasing stream. But the effort was national. The Fisher Body division of General Motors, the Pressed Steel Car Company, the Ford Motor Company, and a host of other industrial giants all contributed to the Sherman's production. This massive, decentralized manufacturing network was a strategic advantage in itself. It meant that no single bombing raid could halt the flow of tanks. The design of the Sherman was a key enabler of this production miracle. It was not an elegant machine. It was designed with simple, flat plane surfaces where possible, making the armor plates easier to manufacture and weld. It used a radial aircraft engine that was already in mass production, avoiding the need to develop and tool up for a brand new power plant. Every component, from the suspension bogies to the transmission, was engineered not just for performance, but for ease of manufacture and interchangeability. This meant that a part made in a factory in Michigan would fit perfectly into a tank assembled in Pennsylvania, a critical factor for field maintenance and repair thousands of miles away. This philosophy of good enough was a form of genius. The Sherman's 75mm gun might not have been able to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at 1,000 meters, but it was an excellent high-explosive delivery system for supporting infantry, a role tanks spent the majority of their time in. The armor might have been thinner, but it was sufficient to protect against the majority of anti-tank weapons on the battlefield, and the tank's mechanical reliability was second to none. American crews could count on their Shermans to get them to the battle, a claim many German crews in their over-engineered and temperamental Panthers and Tigers could not always make. The true weapon, therefore, was not the individual tank. It was the roaring, clanking, 24-hour-a-day symphony of production in the American heartland. It was the ability to absorb staggering losses and replace them almost immediately. When a German Tiger was lost, it was a significant blow, a loss of a rare and valuable asset. When a Sherman was lost, it was a tragedy for the crew, but for the American Army, its replacement was already on a ship, crossing the Atlantic. This relentless, crushing logic of production was the foundation upon which Allied victory was built. The German Panzer crews in the desert had seen a tank. They had not seen the thousands more that stood behind it, an endless river of steel flowing from the unassailable fortress of American industry. Section 3. Baptism in Fire and Sand. The first true test for the M4, Sherman and its American crews, came not in the green fields of Europe, but under the blazing sun of North Africa. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion in November of 1942, saw the Sherman deployed in significant numbers for the first time by American forces. For the GIs of the 1st Armored Division, this was their baptism of fire, a harsh introduction to the realities of mechanized combat against a seasoned and formidable foe, the German Afrika Korps. In the early stages of the Tunisian campaign, the Sherman proved to be a revelation. Against the most common German tanks of the theater, the Panzer III and the Panzer IV, in its earlier variants, the Sherman was more than a match. Its 75mm gun could comfortably deal with their armor, and its own armor provided good protection against their cannons. American tankers, fresh from training stateside, quickly came to appreciate their new mounts. The Sherman was, compared to other tanks of the period, a relatively comfortable and user-friendly machine. It was equipped with a power-traversing turret, which was significantly faster than the manual traverse systems in many German tanks, allowing the gunner to get on target more quickly. Every Sherman came equipped with a radio, a seemingly small detail that was, in fact, a massive tactical advantage. It allowed for unprecedented levels of communication and coordination between tanks in a platoon, and between the tanks and their commanders. This was a stark contrast to many other armies, including the Soviets, whose tanks often lacked radios, forcing commanders to rely on clumsy flag signals. The Sherman's mechanical reliability, honed by the standards of the American automotive industry, was perhaps its greatest asset in the punishing North African environment. The fine desert sand was a notorious enemy of machinery, capable of grinding down engines and transmissions with relentless efficiency. The German tanks, particularly the early Tigers, which made their debut in Tunisia, were mechanically complex and proved to be highly susceptible to breakdowns in these harsh conditions. The Sherman, with its robust and relatively simple Wright R975 Whirlwind radial engine, proved to be a durable workhorse. It kept running when other, more sophisticated machines failed. This reliability meant that more Shermans were available for battle on any given day, a crucial factor in a campaign of attrition. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 was a brutal lesson for the inexperienced American forces. They were outmaneuvered and outfought by the veteran Germans, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. American units suffered heavy losses, and for a time, it seemed like a catastrophic defeat. Yet, even in this setback, the Sherman performed competently. Many of the losses were due to poor tactics and leadership, not the inherent flaws of the tank itself. The battle served as a harsh but necessary learning experience. The American armored forces adapted, they learned, and they grew stronger. Following Kasserine, under the new and dynamic leadership of commanders like General George S. Patton, the tide began to turn. In engagements like the Battle of El Guitar, American tankers, now with more experience under their belts, began to use their Shermans with greater skill and confidence. They learned to use their superior numbers to their advantage, employing flanking maneuvers to strike at the weaker side and rear armor of the German Panzers. They learned to coordinate closely with their artillery, which was both excellent and plentiful, using it to suppress German anti-tank guns before an advance. They learned that the Sherman, while perhaps not the equal of a Tiger in a head-to-head fight, was a key component of a much larger and more flexible combined arms team. By the end of the Tunisian campaign in May 1943, the Sherman had established itself as the definitive Allied tank of the Western Front. It had proven that it was a capable and effective weapon, a jack-of-all-trades that could perform a variety of roles, from engaging enemy armor to providing fire support for the infantry. The crews who survived the harsh education of North Africa emerged as a core of seasoned veterans, their initial anxieties replaced by a quiet confidence in their machines and in themselves. The experience gained in the desert, in learning how to fight, how to maintain, and how to win with the Sherman, would be invaluable in the far tougher battles that lay ahead. The North African campaign was the Sherman's proving ground, the place where the theory of American mass production met the reality of combat. The tank, and the army that wielded it, had been tested by fire and sand, and they had emerged victorious. The crude tank was no longer an unknown quantity. It was now a battle-proven weapon, ready for the long, hard fight for Europe. Section 4. The Mountainous Grind in Italy. After the victory in North Africa, the Allied war machine set its sights on what was often called the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943, followed by the landings on the Italian mainland in September, marked the beginning of one of the longest and most arduous campaigns of the war. If North Africa was a war of sweeping maneuvers across open desert, Italy was its opposite. It was a brutal, inch-by-inch grind through a landscape that seemed purpose-built for defense. The Italian peninsula is dominated by the Apennine Mountains, a rugged spine of high peaks and narrow valleys. The terrain was a nightmare for armored warfare. Roads were few, and often clung to the sides of cliffs, easily blocked by a single demolished bridge or a well-placed anti-tank gun. Rivers, swollen by autumn rains, cut through the landscape, creating formidable defensive lines. The Germans, under the masterful command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, took full advantage of this geography, constructing a series of formidable defensive positions, like the Gustav Line, that stretched from coast to coast. In this environment, the grand tank battles of the desert were impossible. The war in Italy became a soldier's war, a series of vicious, small-scale engagements for control of hills, villages, and river crossings. It was in this grinding, attritional conflict that some of the Sherman's less glamorous but equally important virtues came to the fore. Its relatively lightweight and good power-to-weight ratio gave it a strategic mobility that the heavier German tanks, like the Panther, often lacked. The Sherman could traverse rickety bridges and navigate winding mountain roads that would have been impassable for its heavier adversaries. Its narrow track width, while a disadvantage in soft mud, allowed it to squeeze through the tight streets of ancient Italian villages. In this campaign, the Sherman was used less as a hunter of other tanks and more as a piece of mobile artillery, a steel pillbox that could accompany the infantry and provide immediate, direct fire support. A single Sherman, positioned to overlook a German machine gun nest, could save dozens of infantry lives. Its 75mm gun, with its excellent high-explosive shell, was perfect for blasting enemy positions dug into hillsides or fortified in stone farmhouses. The crews became experts at this kind of close-quarters infantry support, learning to work in tandem with the riflemen who could protect them from enemy soldiers with handheld anti-tank weapons. The reliability of the Sherman was, once again, a decisive factor. In the mountains, recovering a disabled tank was an immense challenge. A Panther or Tiger that suffered a transmission failure on a narrow mountain pass was not just out of the fight. It was an obstacle that could block an entire advance for hours or even days. The Sherman's legendary mechanical robustness meant that it broke down far less frequently. American and Allied maintenance crews performed miracles, keeping their fleet of Shermans running in appalling conditions. The simplicity of the Sherman's design and the interchangeability of its parts made their job possible. This logistical superiority meant that Allied commanders could consistently put more armored vehicles at the point of attack than their German counterparts. The Italian campaign was a meat grinder. Progress was slow and costly, measured in yards rather than miles. For the Sherman crews, it was a period of constant stress and danger. The threat was not just from other tanks, but from concealed anti-tank guns, from mines, and from the ever-present German artillery that pre-registered every likely avenue of approach. They fought their way up the Italian boot, through battles with names that would be etched in history for their ferocity: Salerno, Anzio, Monte Cassino. Through it all, the Sherman proved to be the right tool for a difficult job. It was not a war-winning superweapon, but it was a dependable, adaptable, and available one. It was the steel backbone of the Allied advance. The crews learned to respect their machines, to understand their strengths and weaknesses. They knew their tank was vulnerable, but they also knew it would almost always get them where they needed to go, and its gun would be there to support their infantry comrades. The Italian campaign may not have had the epic tank clashes of other fronts, but it was a crucial chapter in the Sherman story. It proved the tank's versatility and resilience in one of the most challenging environments of the entire war. It forged the crews into hardened veterans, ready for the ultimate test that awaited them on the beaches and in the hedgerows of Normandy. The long, hard slog through Italy was a testament to the endurance of both the men and the machine that carried them forward. Section 5. The Shock in the Hedgerows, June 6, 1944. D-Day. The Allied invasion of Normandy marked the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. As thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers stormed the beaches, they were supported by waves of landing craft delivering their armored fist, the M4 Sherman. For the American tankers of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, this was the moment they had trained for. They rolled off the beaches and into the lush, green countryside of Normandy, a landscape that could not have been more different from the deserts of Africa or the mountains of Italy. It was a claustrophobic maze of small fields, sunken lanes, and, most problematically, the bocage. The bocage was a unique feature of the Norman landscape. Ancient, thick hedgerows, earthen banks several feet high, tangled with centuries of dense root growth, and topped with thick bushes and trees. For the attacking Allies, it was a tactical nightmare. For the defending Germans, it was a godsend. Each hedgerow formed a natural, pre-built anti-tank ditch and fortress wall. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, turned the bocage into a lethal killing ground. They would sight a machine gun, an anti-tank gun, or a single, well-camouflaged tank to cover the one or two gaps in a hedgerow, creating a deadly funnel for the advancing Shermans. It was here, in the suffocating confines of the bocage, that the American Sherman crews met the German big cats, the Panther and the Tiger, in large numbers for the first time. The encounter was a profound and brutal shock. The confidence built in Africa and Italy was shattered in a series of violent, one-sided engagements. The Sherman's 75mm gun, which had been adequate against older Panzers, proved almost useless against the thick, well-sloped frontal armor of the Panther. American crews reported watching their shells bounce harmlessly off the German tanks, like pebbles thrown against a battleship, as one tanker described it. The Panther's long, high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 cannon, however, had no such difficulty. It could slice through the Sherman's frontal armor from 1,000 meters or more, well outside the effective range of the American tank's main gun. The situation with the Tiger was even more grim. Its infamous 88mm gun could disable a Sherman from astonishing distances. The psychological impact on the American crews was immense. They felt outgunned and vulnerable. The tall profile of the Sherman, a minor issue in the open desert, became a major liability in the bocage, where it was difficult to find a hull-down position that didn't expose the turret. The myth of the Ronson returned with a vengeance, and the fear of a fire was a constant companion for every crewman. The brutal reality of the Normandy campaign was that the Sherman was, in a direct, one-on-one confrontation with a Panther or a Tiger, technologically outmatched. The German philosophy of qualitative superiority seemed to have been vindicated. German tank aces, hidden in ambush positions, could and did wreak havoc on advancing American armored columns. The losses in men and machines were staggering. It was a dark time for the American armored forces, a period of intense soul-searching and tactical improvisation. But the American soldier is nothing if not adaptable. Faced with a superior foe, the Sherman crews and their commanders did not break. They learned. They developed new tactics to cope with the technological deficit. They realized that trying to engage a Panther frontally was a fool's errand. The standard American tactic became one of teamwork and sacrifice. A platoon of 5 Shermans would advance, with 1 or 2 tanks designated to fire at the front of the German tank, even if their shells couldn't penetrate. The purpose was not to destroy it, but to distract it, to force the German gunner to focus on them. This bait tank and its crew were in mortal danger, but their actions allowed the other 3 or 4 Shermans to maneuver, to race for a flanking position, to try and get a shot into the Panther's thinner side or rear armor. It was a desperate and costly strategy, but it was often the only one that worked. They also developed field modifications, like the Kulin hedgerow cutter, a set of steel tusks welded to the front of the tank that allowed it to bust through the bocage rather than going around it, avoiding the prepared kill zones. The shock of Normandy was real, and it was bloody. It exposed the Sherman's shortcomings in the harshest possible way, but it also revealed the incredible resilience and courage of the men who crewed them. They were fighting a superior machine, and they knew it. Yet day after day, they climbed back into their steel vehicles and advanced into the maze of hedgerows, relying on their numbers, their ingenuity, and their sheer determination to overcome the odds. They were paying a heavy price for the initial underestimation of German tank technology, but they were a part of a larger system, a system that was about to bring its other, overwhelming advantages to bear. Section 6. The answer from the skies and the guns. Faced with the technological superiority of the German Panthers and Tigers in the hedgerows of Normandy, the American High Command did not panic. Instead, they leaned into the core strength of the Allied war effort. The doctrine of combined arms. The solution to the Panther problem was not to build a better tank overnight. It was to use the entire orchestra of war to neutralize the threat. The Sherman tank was not expected to fight alone. It was the centerpiece of a team, and its most powerful teammates flew in the skies above and fired from the artillery batteries miles behind the front lines. The skies over Normandy in the summer of 1944 belonged almost completely to the Allies. The German Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, and Allied fighter bombers roamed the battlefield with near impunity. This air supremacy became the great equalizer in the tank versus tank equation. The most feared aircraft from the perspective of a German Panzer crew were the American Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Hawker Typhoon. These were not graceful dogfighters. They were brutish, powerful, and heavily armed aircraft, designed to survive in the hazardous low-level environment and deliver a devastating punch. A pilot in a P-47, often referred to as the Jug for its bulky shape, could carry a payload of rockets and bombs nearly equal to that of a light bomber. Orbiting over the front lines, directed by a ground controller who might be riding in a command vehicle just behind the lead Shermans, these pilots acted as airborne tank destroyers. When an American armored column was held up by a concealed Panther or Tiger, the call would go out. The ground controller would relay the approximate position, and the Thunderbolts would roll in. For the German crew, the experience was terrifying. The first sign of an attack would be the distinctive, menacing whine of the Thunderbolt's engine as it began its dive. Then came the rockets, streaking towards them, or the deafening crump of 500-pound bombs exploding nearby. Even a near miss from a bomb could be enough to disable a heavy tank, breaking its tracks, damaging its delicate optics, or, at the very least, forcing the crew to abandon their vehicle. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical one. German tank movements during the day became almost suicidal, forcing them to operate primarily at dawn, dusk, or under the cover of darkness and bad weather. This severely limited their tactical flexibility and negated much of the advantage of their long-range guns. The second part of the solution came from the artillery. American artillery was arguably the best of the war. Accurate, responsive, and, most importantly, incredibly abundant. The U.S. Army had a seemingly endless supply of artillery shells and the guns to fire them. When a German tank was identified, it was not just the Shermans that would engage it. A fire mission would be called in, and within minutes, an entire grid square could be saturated with high explosive shells from dozens of 105mm and 155mm howitzers. While a direct hit was needed to destroy a heavy tank, the sheer volume of fire could achieve the same results as an airstrike. It could break tracks, shatter periscopes, and suppress the accompanying German infantry, leaving the tank isolated and vulnerable. This seamless coordination was made possible by the radio in every Sherman. A tank commander pinned down by a Panther could get on the radio and speak directly to his artillery liaison or call for air support. This ability to instantly summon the overwhelming power of the entire Allied arsenal was a weapon the Germans simply could not match. Their communications were less reliable, and their air and artillery support was, by this stage of the war, scarce. So, while a one-on-one duel between a Sherman and a Panther was a mismatch, this scenario rarely happened. The real battle was a 5-on-1 fight. 5 Shermans, a squadron of Thunderbolts, and a dozen batteries of artillery all converging on a single German tank. This was the American way of war. It was a systems-based approach that leveraged industrial might and technological superiority in other areas, like aviation and communications, to solve a problem on the ground. The individual Sherman crewman may have felt like a David facing Goliath, but he was a David with an air force and an army's worth of artillery at his beck and call. The answer to German quality was not just American quantity, but a symphony of coordinated, overwhelming force. Section 7. Sharpening the sword. While combined arms tactics were the immediate answer to the German big cats, the American and British military establishments were not idle on the technological front. They knew that a more direct, tank-based solution was needed. The development of an entirely new tank would take too long, so the focus shifted to upgrading and improving the existing, mass-produced Sherman platform. This parallel track of innovation and evolution demonstrates that the Allied strategy was not solely reliant on numbers, but also on a pragmatic and rapid response to battlefield realities. The most significant American upgrade came in the form of the M4A3E8, a designation that was thankfully shortened by the troops to the Easy 8. This late-war model of the Sherman featured two crucial improvements. The first was a new, more powerful main gun, the 76mm M1 cannon. While it still struggled against the frontal plate of a Panther, it had significantly better armor penetration than the old 75mm gun, especially when firing new types of ammunition like armor-piercing, capped, ballistic-capped, APCBC, and the later armor-piercing, composite-rigid, APCR rounds. This gave Sherman crews a fighting chance in a frontal engagement, allowing them to penetrate the Panther's turret face, or lower hull, at reasonable combat distances. The second major upgrade was the horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS. This new, wider track system replaced the older, narrower, vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS. The HVSS provided a much smoother ride, which not only reduced crew fatigue, but also made the tank a more stable firing platform, allowing for greater accuracy while on the move. It also provided better flotation over soft ground, improving the tank's cross-country mobility. The Easy 8 was the Sherman perfected, the culmination of years of combat experience and engineering feedback. However, the most potent Sherman variant to see combat was not an American creation, but a brilliant piece of British ingenuity. The British Army, facing the same threats in Normandy, devised a way to fit their phenomenal ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder anti-tank gun into the Sherman's turret. The 17-pounder was a truly exceptional weapon, a long-barreled high-velocity cannon capable of defeating the frontal armor of both the Tiger and the Panther at ranges of over 1,000 meters. The resulting hybrid was christened the Sherman Firefly. It was not a simple modification. The 17-pounder was so large that it had to be mounted on its side, and the radio had to be moved to a box welded onto the back of the turret. The recoil was so violent that a large counterweight was needed on the rear of the turret. But the result was a tank that combined the reliability and availability of the Sherman with a gun that could beat the best Germany had to offer. The Firefly became the dedicated cat killer in British, Canadian, and Polish armored formations. German tank commanders quickly learned to identify and fear the Firefly, recognizing its dangerously long barrel. British crews would often try to camouflage the gun's length with paint to make it look like a standard, less threatening 75mm Sherman, hoping to lure the German tanks into a fatal engagement. Perhaps the most famous testament to the Firefly's effectiveness occurred on August 8, 1944, during Operation Totalize in Normandy. The renowned German tank ace Michael Wittmann, a commander in the 12th SS Panzer Division, was leading a group of Tiger tanks in a counterattack. A Sherman Firefly from the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, commanded by Sergeant Gordon and gunned by Trooper Joe Ekins, lay in wait. From a concealed position, Ekins opened fire. In a matter of minutes, his Firefly, along with others in his squadron, engaged Wittmann's group. The engagement was swift and decisive. Several Tigers, including the one carrying Wittmann and his crew, were disabled and left smoking on the field. The destruction of the vehicle of Germany's most celebrated tank commander by a modified Sherman was a powerful symbol. It demonstrated that with the right weapon, the technological gap could be closed. The evolution of the Sherman into models like the EZ-8 and the Firefly was a critical part of the story. It showed that the Allied industrial machine was not just a blunt instrument, it was also a learning system. It could adapt, innovate, and produce solutions that gave its soldiers the tools they needed to face and defeat the enemy's best. The combination of overwhelming numbers of standard Shermans, backed by these specialized and outgunned variants, created a multi-layered threat that the beleaguered German Panzer divisions simply could not overcome. Section 8. The Miracle of Maintenance and Supply. In the grand narrative of warfare, logistics is the unseen giant upon whose shoulders victory is carried. It is a story not of heroic charges, but of fuel depots, spare parts inventories, and the tireless work of mechanics in greasy overalls. And in the story of the M4 Sherman, logistics was its secret, war-winning superpower. The German Panzers, for all their technological prowess, were plagued by a logistical nightmare. The Panther and the Tiger were masterpieces of engineering, but they were also incredibly complex. They were over-engineered, filled with sophisticated components that were difficult to manufacture and even harder to repair in the field. A simple transmission failure in a Panther, a common occurrence, was a major crisis. It required specialized heavy lifting equipment and highly trained technicians, resources that were increasingly scarce for the German army. A repair that might take several days in a fully equipped workshop back in Germany could be impossible to perform near the front lines. Consequently, a huge number of German heavy tanks were not lost to enemy action, but were simply abandoned by their crews when they broke down, often to be scuttled with demolition charges to prevent their capture. Each abandoned Tiger was a permanent loss of an almost irreplaceable asset. The American approach, born from its automotive culture, was the polar opposite. The Sherman was designed from the ground up not just for combat, but for ease of maintenance and repair. It was built with standardized, interchangeable parts. The engine, a Wright radial aircraft engine, was a mature and reliable design that many mechanics were already familiar with. It could be removed and replaced in the field in a matter of hours, not days. The suspension bogies, the transmission, the electrical systems, all were designed to be accessible and relatively simple to work on. This design philosophy was backed by a logistical and recovery system of unparalleled scale and efficiency. Every American armored division had its own dedicated ordnance and maintenance battalions. These units were equipped with M32 tank recovery vehicles, which were themselves built on a Sherman chassis. When a Sherman was damaged in combat, perhaps its track was blown off by a mine, or its engine was hit by a shell, it was rarely the end of its story. The recovery crews would move in, often under fire, to tow the disabled tank back to a forward maintenance area. There, teams of mechanics would descend upon it. They worked with a speed and efficiency that was a marvel of the modern age. If a suspension unit was damaged, they would unbolt it and bolt on a new one. If the engine was beyond repair, they would hoist it out and drop in a replacement. Parts were plentiful, flown or shipped in from the United States in a continuous, uninterrupted stream. A Sherman that was knocked out of action in the morning could often be repaired, rearmed, and back at the front line with a new crew by the next day. This had a profound impact on the operational strength of American armored units. While a German Panzer division's combat power would steadily and irreversibly decline as it suffered mechanical and combat losses, an American division's strength remained remarkably consistent. Tanks were recycled back into the fight at an astonishing rate. This also had a crucial effect on crew experience. When a German tank was destroyed, its experienced crew was often lost. When a Sherman was disabled, the crew frequently survived, and could be assigned to a repaired or replacement tank. This allowed crews and units to retain and build upon their combat experience, becoming more effective and veteran over time. The American system didn't just replace its machines. It preserved its most valuable asset, its trained soldiers. The German Panzer crews who initially scoffed at the Sherman's simple design failed to understand that this simplicity was not a weakness, but a profound strategic strength. Each Sherman was part of a vast, regenerative ecosystem of production, supply, and repair. A German Tiger was a magnificent but fragile predator. The Sherman was more like an ant, individually modest, but part of a colony that was resilient, adaptable, and ultimately unconquerable. This unseen, unglamorous world of logistics and maintenance was the true engine of the Allied victory on the Western Front. Section 9. The Winter War and the Bulge. By December 1944, the Allied armies had pushed the German forces back across France and were poised to strike into Germany itself. The war seemed to be in its final stages. But the German leadership had one last, desperate gamble to play. A massive surprise offensive through the dense, snow-covered forests of the Ardennes region in Belgium. This would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan was to use their best remaining armored divisions, spearheaded by Tiger II and Panther tanks, to punch through a weak sector of the American lines, drive to the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. The attack, launched in the midst of a harsh winter and under the cover of thick fog and cloud that grounded the all-powerful Allied air forces, achieved complete surprise. For the American units caught in the initial onslaught, it was a terrifying and chaotic experience. The German armored columns, shrouded in mist and snow, seemed unstoppable. It was in this crucible of cold and desperation that the M4 Sherman and its crews arguably had their finest hour. They were, once again, technologically outmatched by the heavy German tanks, especially the formidable new 71-ton Tiger II. But in the brutal conditions of the Ardennes winter, the Sherman's inherent strengths proved decisive. The narrow, icy forest roads and snow-choked fields were a severe test of mechanical reliability. The complex German tanks, pushed to their limits, began to break down in the intense cold. More critically, they were voracious consumers of fuel, and the German offensive was operating on a shoestring fuel budget. The Sherman, with its reliable engine and better fuel economy, kept running. As the German spearheads advanced, they were met by scattered but incredibly tenacious groups of American defenders. Sherman tanks were at the heart of this defense. In key towns like St. Vith and, most famously, Bastogne, Shermans were used as mobile pillboxes, fighting desperate close-range battles against superior German armor. The crews used the terrain to their advantage, lying in ambush in forests and villages, waiting for the German tanks to expose their vulnerable side armor. The new 76mm guns of the EZ-8 Shermans and the specialized M10, M18, and M36 tank destroyers that fought alongside them were crucial in these engagements, providing the firepower needed to stop the German advance. The Battle of the Bulge was not a battle of grand armored maneuvers. It was a series of brutal, small unit actions. It was a test of endurance, resilience, and courage. American tankers, often isolated and outnumbered, fought with a grim determination. They knew that they were all that stood between the German army and a catastrophic breakthrough. When the weather finally broke and the skies cleared, the balance shifted decisively. The Allied fighter-bombers returned, and the German armored columns, stuck on the roads and out of fuel, became prime targets. General Patton's Third Army, in a remarkable feat of logistics and maneuver, wheeled 90 degrees and raced north to relieve the besieged defenders of Bastogne, with his Sherman-equipped armored divisions leading the charge. The Battle of the Bulge was the death rattle of the German Panzer arm. They had thrown their best remaining forces into the offensive and had lost them. They had lost hundreds of irreplaceable heavy tanks, not just to Allied action, but to mechanical failure and lack of fuel. The Americans, by contrast, could absorb their heavy losses and, thanks to their production and recovery system, rapidly reconstitute their armored divisions. The battle was a resounding vindication of the American military philosophy. It proved that in the attritional, grinding reality of modern warfare, logistical strength, mechanical reliability, and sheer numbers, combined with the unbreakable spirit of the individual soldier, would ultimately triumph over a strategy based purely on technological sophistication. The Sherman, the tank once dismissed as crude and inadequate, had stood its ground in the bitterest winter, against the enemy's finest, and had held the line. It had proven itself not just a tool of mass production, but a symbol of American resilience. Section 10. A verdict on two philosophies. By the spring of 1945, the outcome of the war on the Western Front was no longer in doubt. Allied armies with their legions of Sherman tanks were pouring into Germany from the west, while the Soviet tide advanced from the east. The once mighty German Wehrmacht was a broken force, fighting a hopeless battle on its own soil. The final verdict on the long and bitter duel between the Sherman and the German Panzers was being written not in a single, decisive battle, but in the overwhelming, mathematical certainty of Allied victory. The story of the Sherman is the story of two conflicting philosophies of war, brought to a final, definitive conclusion. The German philosophy was one of perfectionism and technological elitism. They sought to build the perfect weapon, the invincible tank that would dominate the battlefield through sheer qualitative superiority. In this, they partially succeeded. The Panther and the Tiger were, on a one-on-one basis, magnificent fighting machines, respected and feared by every Allied soldier who faced them. They were the products of a brilliant engineering tradition, but also of a strategic miscalculation. The Germans built weapons for a short, decisive war, a war they could win with a series of lightning-fast, devastating blows. They failed to prepare for a long, grinding war of industrial attrition. The American philosophy, embodied by the Sherman, was one of pragmatism and mass production. The goal was not to build the perfect tank, but to build a good enough tank and to build it in such vast quantities that its presence would be felt on every front, in every battle. The Sherman was a tool designed to be part of a larger system. It was a reliable, adaptable, and easily maintained platform that could be effectively integrated into a combined arms doctrine of overwhelming air power, artillery, and infantry. Its designers understood that the most powerful tank in the world is useless if it is broken down by the side of the road, or if it is the only one on a battlefield where the enemy has 5. By 1945, the strategic landscape was a stark illustration of these two philosophies' results. For every one German tank, Panther, Tiger, or Panzer IV, that the Allies encountered, there were, on average, 5 or 6 Shermans to meet it. The skies were clear of the Luftwaffe, allowing Allied aircraft to hunt German armor at will. The logistical chain that supplied the Shermans with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts was robust and efficient, stretching all the way back to the factories of Detroit. The German logistical system, by contrast, was in a state of collapse, shattered by bombing and the loss of resources. To dismiss the Sherman as a crude or bad tank is to miss the point entirely. It was, arguably, the most strategically important and decisive tank of the Second World War. It was the tank that was there, on the beaches of Normandy, in the mountains of Italy, in the deserts of Africa, and in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, in the numbers that mattered. It was the physical manifestation of the industrial and strategic might of the United States. The initial laughter of the German tank crews in 1942 was understandable, based on their own metrics of what made a good tank. But they were judging a single instrument, not the entire orchestra. They failed to hear the rising crescendo of American production, a sound that would ultimately drown out the roar of their own powerful but few panzers. The legacy of the Sherman is a powerful lesson in the nature of modern conflict. It teaches us that victory is not always achieved by the sharpest sword, but often by the side with the most swords and the ability to keep them on the field. It is a testament to the idea that quantity, when backed by a sound strategy, superior logistics, and the courage of the soldiers who wield it, becomes a quality all its own, a crushing, war-winning quality that changed the course of history.